My name is Daniel Cole. I'm 32 years old. I work in cybersecurity, the kind of job where everything is quiet on the outside, but intense underneath. I've always been the one people overlooked. Quiet, obedient, the so-called peacemaker of the family, and for most of my life, I lived like I was trying to earn a place in a house I was born into. But the day my mother stormed into my apartment, holding a wrinkled medical folder and screaming that I was letting my sister die, something snapped in me, and I knew nothing would ever be the same again. Growing up, my sister Elise was the golden child, blonde, brilliant, magnetic. I, on the other hand, was the one who kept to himself. Elise could get away with anything, breaking curfew, crashing the car, even once stealing money from our father's wallet. If I so much as forgot to do the dishes, it was a disrespectful tantrum. But it wasn't just favoritism. Elise was cruel. She humiliated me at school, told people I was adopted, and once locked me in a closet for hours while our parents were out. When I told them, my mom laughed and said, "She's just playing, don't be so sensitive." I left home at 18 and didn't look back. Still, I sent birthday cards, called on holidays, did everything a good son is supposed to, but they never saw me, only Elise. So when they called saying she had liver failure and needed a partial transplant, I expected them to beg. Instead, they demanded, "You're a match," my mother hissed. "The least you can do is save your sister's life." I hadn't spoken Elise in almost 7 years. She never apologized for the way she treated me, not once. But suddenly, I was supposed to give her part of my body. I asked for time to think. That's when things got ugly. My mother showed up unannounced, furious, shaking a ripped-open envelope with my test results inside. She had already accessed my medical file without permission. "How dare you hesitate?" she screamed. "You're her brother. You owe her this." My father stood behind her, arms folded, silent at first, until he stepped forward and muttered, "We should have known he'd let her die. He's always been a selfish mistake." I felt something leave me in that moment. Some final strand that had held me to them. I stared at them, not as my parents, but as strangers. They weren't asking me to help. They were using me, and they had been doing it my entire life. But I didn't yell. I didn't defend myself. I simply nodded and said, "Fine. Let's do the tests again." My voice was steady. My hands were calm. But inside, something ancient and cold was waking up, something patient. I didn't go to the clinic alone. I brought a friend, a doctor I trusted, someone who knew how to ask the right questions and get real answers, because something about this didn't feel right. And I was done giving parts of myself away to people who never once asked what it cost me. The night after that confrontation, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was afraid, but because the fog had finally lifted. For the first time in my life, I saw the roles we had all been assigned. Elise was the chosen one, the fragile jewel. Even when she was cruel, I was the backup generator, useful, silent, expected to give without being noticed. It was a pattern so deeply ingrained in our family that even I had started believing it. Loyalty, they called it. Family duty. But now I saw it for what it really was. Emotional blackmail, dressed as love. I remembered birthdays where I was ignored because Elise was throwing a tantrum. Holidays where I was guilted into leaving early so Elise could have the house to herself. I remembered how she once broke my nose during a fight, and how my parents punished me for making her upset. I swallowed every injustice like communion, convinced that if I kept sacrificing, maybe one day they'd see me. But that day never came. Not even now, when they needed a literal piece of me to save her life. When I arrived at the hospital for the second round of compatibility tests, I felt like I was stepping onto a battlefield. My friend Dr. Meyer was already there. She'd pulled a few strings to make sure the lab handled my samples discreetly. As I sat in the exam room, I caught a glimpse of Elise being wheeled past in a wheelchair. She didn't look sick, she looked annoyed, as if waiting for my liver was just another inconvenience in her day. She didn't even look at me. Later that day, I got a call from Dr. Meyer. Her voice was careful. She said, "Daniel, I need to talk to you in person." That's never a good sign, especially from a doctor. When I met her in her office, she handed me a folder. "You're not a match," she said gently. "At least, not in the way they think." I frowned. "But the records," she cut me off. "Yes, you're a match. But not because you're her brother. Genetically, Daniel, you're not related to her, or to them." I sat still. The room spun, but my expression didn't change. I felt numb, not shocked. Somewhere deep down, I had always suspected I didn't belong. But to hear it confirmed that I wasn't even their biological son was a revelation and a relief. The pieces clicked together like gears in a long-stuck clock finally turning. I hadn't been treated like family because I wasn't. They had raised me, yes, but they never loved me. Not truly. Dr. Meyer waited for my response. I said nothing. I just closed the folder and stood up. "Can you print me the documentation?" I asked. She nodded. That night, I placed the papers in a sealed envelope and slid it into the drawer beside my bed. I wasn't ready to use it yet. But I knew I would, because when someone tries to force you to bleed for them, they should at least make sure you're theirs to begin with. I didn't call them. I didn't show up to the house. I didn't even respond to the frantic texts my mother sent after the hospital told her the surgery was delayed for further testing. She accused me of dragging my feet. My father sent a single message: "Get over your pride and do what's right." Not a single person asked if I was okay, if I was scared, if I needed time. They spoke as if I were a tool, malfunctioning, disobedient, disposable. And so for the first time in my life, I decided to act like something far more dangerous, someone with nothing left to lose. I spent the next week planning. Not out of anger, not even revenge. I just wanted the truth to stand. I wanted it to be undeniable, clean, permanent. I reached out to a lawyer friend, asked what it would take to pull my full birth records. Then I requested the legal adoption documents, if they existed. What came back was illuminating. I had been placed with my parents through a private, closed adoption. No records of my biological parents, no transparency, no follow-up. Just a baby delivered to people who, it seemed, had always wanted a son, but never really wanted me. I also dug into Elise's medical situation. My friend helped me quietly contact another specialist. Turns out, Elise had been warned years ago about her drinking, her lifestyle, her poor choices. She'd burned bridges with doctors, ignored advice. She had this coming, and she knew it, but she needed a donor. And to the people who raised me, that's all I ever was, conveniently useful. I was never a son, just spare part. Then I thought about the moment that would matter most. Not a confrontation. No raised voices or slammed doors. I wanted them to sit in a room, face the truth, and feel it settle like dust. They couldn't sweep away. I scheduled a meeting at the hospital, told my mother the tests were finalized and we needed to talk in person. She sounded relieved. "Finally," she said, voice sharp, with resentment. "You're doing what you should have done from the start." When they arrived, I was already seated with Dr. Meyer. The medical folder was in front of her. My mother gave me a tight-lipped glance, like someone holding back a storm. My father didn't look at me. Elise wasn't there, too sick or too uninterested. Dr. Meyer opened the folder calmly, flipping to a page with the DNA test. She said 6 words I had rehearsed in my head for days. "Daniel is not Elise's biological sibling." My mother's face turned the color of paper. Her hands gripped the armrests. My father sat back slowly, blinking, like he hadn't heard her right. But I had. I'd heard every word, and for once, the silence that followed belonged to me. I had all the power, not to punish, not to scream, but to leave them sitting in their own unraveling lies. The silence after Dr. Meyer's words was suffocating. My mother didn't cry, she didn't scream. She just stared at me like I was some strange reflection in a mirror, familiar and foreign all at once. My father finally broke the silence, voice low and brittle. "What are you talking about?" he asked. Dr. Meyer explained again, gently, clearly. There was no mistake. The DNA didn't match. I was not biologically related to either of them. I didn't speak. I just watched them process. The truth had finally entered the room, and it didn't need me to narrate it. My mother shook her head, visibly trembling. "That's impossible," she muttered. We raised him. We were there when he was born." But she knew. Somewhere inside, she knew. I could see it in her eyes, the panic behind her confusion, the way her mind started racing backward through time, trying to find a thread that would hold it all together. My father's jaw tightened. He looked at me like I had betrayed them, as if I had created this, when in fact, I had only discovered it. I stood up slowly and placed a copy of the results in front of them. "I won't be donating," I said calmly, "and you won't be contacting me again." My voice was level, not cold, not cruel, just finished. The kind of finality that doesn't need a door to be slammed to feel like one. My mother opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. And that, in itself, was a small kind of justice. For once, I had said something that couldn't be talked over or undone. After that meeting, everything began to shift, quietly, naturally, like dominoes falling with soft clicks. Elise's condition worsened, and she was placed on the transplant waiting list. My parents called several times, but I didn't pick up. They left voicemails that swung between desperation and guilt-tripping. "She's your sister. Don't punish us for the past. You are always part of this family." But they were just words, brittle, late and empty. I blocked the numbers without listening further. A few weeks later, I heard from an old neighbor that my parents had started selling off assets to cover Elise's treatments. The house I grew up in was listed. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't smile. I felt nothing, not because I was numb, but because I had finally healed the wound they spent decades pretending wasn't there. I wasn't their emergency backup plan anymore. I was free, and perhaps the most poetic part of it all. No one knew. No public drama. No family-wide expose. I didn't post anything, didn't seek revenge online. I just let the truth sit exactly where it landed, in their hands, on their conscience, in their now fractured narrative. Quiet justice, the kind that echoes far louder than rage ever could. The calls didn't stop immediately. In fact, they got more frantic, not from Elise, but from my mother. There was a shift in her voice, one that tried to sound like regret, but still carried that old sharpness, as if she couldn't quite let go of control. "You're still her brother in every way that matters," she said in a voicemail. "We raised you. We loved you. But love doesn't tear up your medical records. It doesn't drag you into a hospital screaming accusations. And it sure doesn't crumble when tested." Eventually, they stopped reaching out. I suppose it sank in that I meant what I said. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Elise's health took a turn. The doctors were struggling to find a living donor, and her time was narrowing. My parents had burned bridges with extended family years ago. Elise had alienated anyone who once tried to help her. It was like watching a house collapse from within, not because someone set it on fire, but because no one ever repaired the cracks. One day, a letter came, handwritten, From my father. It was short. Not an apology. He never was one for that. Just a sentence that read, "I don't know who you are anymore." I stared at the paper for a long time before placing it in the shredder. He was right. He didn't know me. The version of me they'd relied on all those years, the one who bent, who stayed quiet, who sacrificed, that man was gone. In his place stood someone they couldn't manipulate anymore, someone they could no longer define. But even in their silence, I felt their unraveling. Word got around that the community support they'd once relied on had dwindled. People heard bits and pieces of the story, not the full truth. I never spoke it aloud, but just enough to sense something had gone wrong. Their reputation, once untouchable, became brittle. I didn't have to lift a finger. I simply stayed still, and the truth did the work for me. I wasn't proud of Elise's suffering. I didn't rejoice in her pain, but I also didn't feel guilty. Not anymore. I had offered my life to a family that had never valued mine, and when the time came, I chose to preserve what little I had left. I chose myself. That decision, quiet, resolute, final, was the beginning of something new. Not vengeance, not spite, but peace. Because sometimes the real victory isn't watching someone fall. It's realizing you don't have to catch them. Months passed. I changed my number, moved to a different part of the city, and built something I had never really had before. A life that was mine. No performance, no constant bracing for guilt or manipulation, no second-guessing my worth. I started spending more time with friends who saw me clearly, who valued me without needing anything in return. I found laughter again, not the nervous kind that hides behind discomfort, but real, full laughter, the kind you feel in your ribs, the kind you never knew you were missing. I never told anyone the full story, not even the people closest to me. It wasn't shame that kept me silent, it was power. Some things lose their sanctity when spoken out loud. This truth, the one I carried now, was mine alone. Letting it quietly sit inside me, solid and unshakable, felt like the final step in my freedom. I didn't need validation or revenge. I had my peace, and peace, I learned, is the loudest silence there is. From time to time, I'd hear about Elise's condition. She was still alive. Somehow, still bitter, from what I was told. My parents had disappeared into their own silence. No Christmas cards, no final letters. I suspect the truth burned a hole in their identity, one they couldn't patch over. They had built their lives around a story that no longer held. And once that story unraveled, so did they. I didn't have to punish them. Life did it on its own. You can only bend truth for so long before it breaks you. Some evenings I'd sit on my small apartment balcony with a cup of tea and just breathe in the quiet. No demands, no footsteps coming down the hallway with accusations. Just wind and light and the memory of choosing myself. I had survived the kind of betrayal that most people never speak of. Not the betrayal of strangers, but of the ones who were supposed to protect you, and I hadn't just survived it. I had risen from it, stronger, smarter, whole. If I've learned anything, it's this. Blood doesn't define loyalty, DNA doesn't create family, and silence, when chosen wisely, can be the most powerful voice you'll ever use. I walked away with my body intact, but more importantly, I walked away with my soul restored. And somewhere behind the closed doors of a crumbling house I once called home, they still don't understand how they lost me. That's the part they'll never accept, because in the end, I didn't take anything from them. I simply stopped giving. Time has a strange way of softening memories while sharpening truth. A year passed. Then two. I didn't mark anniversaries of that day in the hospital, but my body always knew when it was coming. I'd wake up earlier, drink my coffee slower, and find myself lost in thought, not in regret, never that, but in recognition. The echoes of my past didn't disappear. They became quieter companions, and sometimes, without warning, I'd remember how my mother's voice cracked when she realized I wasn't hers. That sound never fully leaves you. I didn't chase healing. It came to me slowly, in the form of small, consistent choices. Saying no without guilt, walking away without explaining, letting people earn my trust instead of assuming they deserved it. I began therapy, something I had once seen as indulgent, but it turned out to be the most radical act of self-loyalty I'd ever made. With every session, I peeled back the layers of old conditioning, that programmed belief that my pain was less important than keeping peace. One evening, I received a message from an unknown email. It was Elise. The subject line read, "Only, please." I hovered over it for a while before clicking. Her message wasn't long. No apology, no real vulnerability. Just a note saying she had heard I was doing well, and that she hoped I had no hard feelings. I closed the email. Didn't respond. She wasn't reaching out to reconnect. She was searching for relief. Hers, not mine, and I had learned by now that my peace was not something I'd loan out anymore. Oddly, I wasn't angry. If anything, I pitied her. Elise had been raised on delusion, taught that the world should bend to her needs, that accountability was a threat. And when reality finally stood its ground, she found herself unprepared. I didn't envy her, and I didn't feel obligated to rescue her from the very story she wrote. She had chapters of her own to confront, and I refused to bleed for her plot twist again. Around this time, I started volunteering with a youth mentorship program. Most of the boys were like I had been, overlooked, dismissed, carrying wounds they didn't yet have names for. I didn't lecture them. I just listened. And maybe that's what they needed most. Someone to say, "I see you," without expecting anything back. It was healing in reverse, giving the compassion I was once denied. Not because I was better, but because I finally understood how powerful being seen truly is. That was the year I began writing again. Just journaling at first, then essays. Eventually I started drafting a memoir, not for publishing but for clarity. Putting it into words helped me see the full arc of my story, not as a victim, not as a villain, but as a man who stood in the wreckage of his origin and chose himself anyway. Writing my story helped me see something I had missed for years. I had spent so much time trying to be chosen by a family that never saw me, that I forgot I had the right to choose myself. The trauma wasn't just in what they did. It was in how I kept proving myself to people who would never give me what I was searching for. That realization hit like cold water. I had mistaken endurance for love, silence for strength, and survival for peace. But I was learning the difference now, one page at a time. I came across an old photo in a drawer, me at 12, standing beside Elise, arms stiff at my sides, while she smiled like she owned the room. My parents had framed it for years. I remember that day clearly. She had pinched me hard right before the photo and told me I wasn't allowed to smile. My mom laughed when I told her. "She's just teasing you," she'd said. Looking at that photo now, I saw more than just two children. I saw the early imprint of a pattern, one who was allowed to shine, and one who was trained to disappear. I didn't throw the photo away. I placed it back in the drawer, not because I needed to keep it, but because I was no longer afraid of it. That boy in the picture wasn't weak. He was surviving the only way he knew how, and now, as a man, I owed him one thing: to never put him in that position again. That meant boundaries. That meant truth. And that meant no longer searching for belonging in places that fed on my silence. I decided to take a solo trip, somewhere quiet, far from the noise of my past. I rented a cabin in the mountains, packed only what I needed: and drove without telling anyone. No distractions, no expectations, just me and the weightless sound of wind through the trees. The first morning, I hiked up a steep path, lungs burning, legs trembling. At the top I found a ridge that overlooked a valley bathed in early light. I sat there for hours, not thinking, just being, and in that stillness, something inside me exhaled for the first time. I thought of my parents then, of Elise. I wondered if they were still angry, still confused, still rewriting the story to make themselves the victims. But none of it mattered now. Not here, not in this silence I had built for myself. They had no access to it, no control over it. They couldn't touch the man I had become. Not anymore. My peace was not conditional on their remorse. It lived in a place they could never reach. When I returned from the mountains, I wasn't looking to start over. I wasn't chasing redemption or closure. I had already found both, not in confrontation, but in reflection. I understood now that healing isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet climb, step by aching step, toward a truth that sets you free, even if no one claps when you reach the summit. Life after healing is quieter, but it's not empty. There are still echoes, memories that brush against the present when you least expect them. Like when I pass a certain street and remember the grocery store where my mother once slapped my hand for picking the wrong cereal, or when I hear a voice that sounds like my father's, low and measured, reminding me of all the things I was never allowed to say back. These moments don't control me anymore, but they do visit. I've stopped fighting them. Now I let them in and let them leave, like wind through an open window. One afternoon, I received a letter with no return address. It was from a woman who claimed to have known my biological mother. She said they were friends once, that she had heard about my story through someone I mentored, and she wanted me to know that my birth mother had always hoped I'd find peace, even if she wasn't able to give it to me herself. There was no photo, no proof, just a simple letter, handwritten with care. I didn't know if it was true, but I read it twice, then folded it and placed it in a drawer beside the old photo of me and Elise. For the first time, I let myself wonder about the woman who brought me into the world. Did she hold me? Did she name me? Was I loved, even briefly, before I was handed off into a life that would carve me into someone silent? Those were questions I didn't need answers to, but it felt like a gift to ask them anyway. A part of me began to soften toward the unknown, to accept that some parts of our origin remain blurry, and that maybe healing is learning to live with the blurred lines. Around that same time, Elise was hospitalized again. Word reached me through one of my former teachers, of all people. She'd kept in touch with my parents for years, and I suppose she thought I should know. "She's not doing well," the email read. "They're trying to find another match. It's not looking good." I read the message twice, then again, and I felt compassion. Not the kind that moves you to action, but the kind that simply sees. I didn't hate Elise anymore, but I still wouldn't go back. That night, I prayed, not for vengeance, not for justice, not even for resolution. I prayed for distance, for protection, for the strength to keep choosing peace over chaos. I didn't want their suffering. I only wanted space to keep growing. Sometimes that's the hardest part about walking away. Not being tempted to return when the house you left behind starts burning. You remember the warmth, not the smoke. I woke up the next morning lighter, as if something had been released, not by a decision, but by a simple acknowledgement. The past may echo, but it doesn't rule. I was building a life rooted in freedom, not reaction. A life where the only legacy I carried was the one I chose to write, and in that choice there was finally silence. Not emptiness, but the kind of silence that feels like home. There comes a point in every story where the final chapter writes itself. Not in a dramatic twist or shocking confrontation, but in the quiet continuation of a life reclaimed. For me, that chapter looks like this. I wake up early, I stretch, I water the plants I once neglected. I check my inbox not for disaster, but for joy. Updates from the boys I mentor, messages from friends I trust, writing invitations from journals I never thought would notice me. My life is simple, intentional, unshakably mine. The memoir I started became more than a personal project. A small publisher picked it up, said they were moved by the emotional clarity, the silence between the lines. The title, Not Yours, Still Whole, it felt right. I didn't write it to expose anyone. I wrote it so that maybe someone somewhere sitting in the dark silence of their own story might hear something that sounds like hope, that sounds like you don't owe anyone your body. You don't have to bleed to belong. You can walk away and still be worthy. At the launch event, a young man came up to me with trembling hands. "I think I'm you," he whispered, "just 10 years behind." We sat on the steps of the bookstore while the sun dipped behind the buildings. He told me about his father's anger, his sister's manipulation, his aching desire to be seen. I didn't offer advice. I just listened. And when he was done, I said the words I had once needed so badly. "You are not what they did to you. You are what you do next." That evening, I walked home beneath a sky thick with stars. No headlines, no applause, just peace. The kind that lingers, the kind that doesn't demand an audience. My phone buzzed, a message from Dr. Maya, congratulating me on the book. I smiled. She had been the beginning of the unraveling, the first person to give me truth with no strings attached. Sometimes healing starts not with a grand revelation, but with someone quietly handing you the key you never knew you were missing. I don't think about Elise much anymore, not because I've erased her, but because I've rewritten the role she played in my life. She was a lesson, so were my parents. Painful, necessary, and ultimately finished. I don't need their apologies to move forward. I don't need their names to mean anything. Their chapter is closed, not with bitterness, but with a period, not a question mark. They taught me what love isn't, and in doing so made room for what love can be. So if you're listening, if you've ever been the invisible one, the too quiet son, the unchosen brother, hear this. Your story doesn't end with them. It starts the moment you decide to stop handing your worth to people too blind to see it. The moment you choose yourself. That's when everything changes. That's when the legacy begins. And mine? I built it myself. Quietly, powerfully, completely free. The end.